You have spent your entire life becoming someone, building identity, constructing self, creating the person you believed you should be. And now you must destroy all of it to discover who you actually are. You believed that becoming yourself would be liberation, would be relief, would be finally arriving at a place where you can rest and be comfortable in your own skin. You thought authenticity was destination you would reach through self-discovery, was answer to the dissatisfaction and disconnection you have been feeling, was key to happiness and fulfillment and sense of belonging you have been seeking. But becoming who you actually are is not liberation, it is devastation. It is psychological dismantling of everything you have built, everyone you have pretended to be, every identity you have constructed to gain approval and belonging and safety. It requires destroying the false self you have spent decades perfecting, abandoning the roles that gave you place in social world, releasing the beliefs and values and goals that were never actually yours, but that you absorbed from family and culture and society. The pain of authenticity is not the pain of discovering darkness within yourself or confronting your flaws or facing your shadow. The pain is the grief of losing who you thought you were, the terror of not knowing who you will become, the loneliness of no longer fitting in places you used to belong, the guilt of disappointing people who love the person you are no longer willing to be, the practical consequences of living according to values that the world does not reward. Understanding the psychological cost of authenticity requires examining not what you gain through becoming yourself, but what you lose, not the destination, but the devastation required to arrive there. You build a self, carefully, deliberately, over years and decades. You call this growing up. It is construction of elaborate lie. The first cost of authenticity is recognizing that the person you have become is not who you are, but is construction you created to survive and belong and gain approval. It is a collection of adaptations and performances and identifications that allowed you to navigate world, but that have no relationship to your actual nature beneath all the conditioning. This recognition is devastating because it means everything you have built, everything you have worked to become, everything you have invested in developing is false structure that must be dismantled if you want to discover what remains when the construction is removed. You adapted to your family's expectations, became the person who would receive their love and approval, suppressed aspects of yourself that threatened family equilibrium or violated family values. You adapted to peer groups and social environments, learned what was acceptable and what was not, shaped yourself to fit in and belong and avoid rejection. You adapted to cultural norms and societal expectations, internalized beliefs about who you should be and what you should want and how you should live. Each adaptation added layer to the construction. Each performance became more automatic. Each identification felt more like who you really are. By the time you reach adulthood, you have constructed entire personality that feels like you, but is actually an elaborate system of adaptations designed to help you survive in environments that required you to be someone other than what you actually were. The constructed self is not conscious deception. You are not intentionally pretending. You genuinely believe this is who you are, because the construction has become so automatic and so deeply integrated that you cannot distinguish between the adapted self and the actual self beneath the adaptation. The cost of authenticity begins when you start to suspect that this person you have become is not who you are. When you begin to feel the disconnection between the life you are living and the life that would actually satisfy you. When you recognize that you have been performing yourself rather than being yourself. This recognition creates crisis because it means you must question everything, must examine every aspect of your identity and ask whether it is genuinely yours or whether it is adaptation you created to survive. Must face that you may need to destroy the self you have spent your entire life building. They loved who you were, who you pretended to be, who you performed for them. You call this being loved. It is being loved for someone you are not. The second cost of authenticity is losing relationships that were based on the false self, discovering that people who loved you actually loved the person you were pretending to be, and may not love or accept or even recognize who you actually are beneath the performance. This loss is excruciating because these relationships often include your closest connections, family, long-term friends, romantic partners, people whose love and approval have been central to your sense of worth and belonging. When you stop performing the adapted self, when you begin expressing your actual values and desires and preferences, when you set boundaries that the false self never set or make choices the false self never made, people respond with confusion or disappointment or anger or rejection. They feel betrayed, feel that you have changed, feel that you are not the person they thought you were. And they are right. You are not that person. You never were. But they loved that person and they do not love this person who is emerging now that you have stopped performing. This creates impossible choice. Continue performing the false self to maintain relationships and belonging, or become authentic and lose people you love. Neither option is acceptable. Continuing to perform means remaining disconnected from yourself, means living life for the rest of your life, means never experiencing what it feels like to be genuinely known and loved for who you actually are. But becoming authentic means devastating losses, means people you love walking away, means being alone in ways you have never been alone because you can no longer return to old connections that required you to be someone you are not. The grief is compounded by recognition that these relationships were never actually intimate despite feeling intimate, that you were never genuinely known despite believing you were known, that the love you received was conditional on maintaining performance that prevented anyone from seeing your actual self. You grieve not just for what you are losing, but for what you never actually had, for the illusion of intimacy that kept you performing rather than being, for the years of connection that now feel like years of elaborate deception where you were hiding and nobody knew you were hiding because you were so skilled at the performance. You had a place, you belonged somewhere, you fit into structures. You call this community. It is conditional acceptance you must now abandon. The third cost of authenticity is losing your place in social world, discovering that the communities and institutions and social structures you belong to cannot accommodate who you actually are, that your belonging was conditional on maintaining the adapted self that fit their requirements. When you become authentic, when you express values or make choices, or live in ways that do not align with the group's norms and expectations, you become outsider, you no longer fit, you lose the sense of belonging and place that has been fundamental to your identity and security. You belonged to a family system that required you to play certain role, to hold certain values, to live in ways that supported family narrative and maintained family dynamics. When you stop playing that role, when you express different values, when you make choices that threaten family equilibrium, you become problem rather than member. You are pressured to conform or you are excluded from the family's emotional and social life. You belong to religious or political or cultural community that provided identity and meaning and connection, but that belonging required accepting beliefs and following practices and conforming to norms that are incompatible with who you actually are. When you question those beliefs or refuse those practices or violate those norms, you are no longer member, you are outsider or traitor or lost soul who needs to be brought back into the fold or expelled. The loss of belonging is terrifying because humans are social animals who evolved to need group membership for survival, because being outside the group triggers ancient fears of exile and abandonment and death, because your sense of identity has been so tied to your place in these structures that losing your place means losing your sense of who you are. You become nobody, belong nowhere, have no community to anchor you or provide meaning or confirm your existence. The freedom of authenticity comes with crushing loneliness of no longer fitting anywhere, of being stranger even to people who have known you your entire life. This loss also includes practical consequences. You may lose career opportunities or social connections or support systems that were available through these communities. You may find yourself without the networks and resources that help people navigate life, may discover that authenticity comes with material costs as well as emotional costs. You disappointed them, let them down, failed their expectations. You call this selfishness. It is refusing to sacrifice yourself for their comfort. The fourth cost of authenticity is guilt, is the psychological weight of disappointing people who had expectations and plans and hopes for you that you are no longer willing to fulfill, is the burden of knowing that your choice to be yourself creates pain and disappointment for people you care about. This guilt is crushing because you genuinely do not want to hurt these people. You care about them and value their happiness, but being authentic requires making choices that disappoint them, and there is no way to avoid this pain. Your parents expected you to follow certain path, career, lifestyle, values, choices, and you are choosing different path. Your partner expected you to be person you were when you met, to want the things you said you wanted, to remain the person they fell in love with, and you are becoming someone different. Your community expected you to uphold certain values and maintain certain roles and perpetuate certain traditions, and you are refusing. In each case, your authenticity is experienced by them as betrayal, as rejection of what they offered you, as abandonment of responsibilities and commitments you made when you were being the false self they loved. The guilt is intensified by recognition that they are not entirely wrong, that you did make promises and commitments when you were being the adapted self, that they invested in relationship with person you were pretending to be, that they organized their lives around expectations that seemed reasonable given who you presented yourself as. You feel responsible for their disappointment, even though you also know that continuing to live according to those expectations would mean destroying yourself, would mean spending rest of your life being someone you are not. This creates moral weight that the adapted self never carried, because the adapted self's purpose was to make others happy and comfortable, to fulfill expectations and gain approval. Being authentic means prioritizing your own truth over others' comfort, means making choices that serve your genuine needs even when those choices disappoint or hurt people you care about. You must learn to carry guilt without letting it control you, must accept that you cannot be authentic without disappointing people, must choose yourself even when that choice causes pain to others. You had goals, dreams you worked toward, plans you were following. You call this ambition. It was pursuing someone else's definition of success. The fifth cost of authenticity is abandoning goals and achievements and markers of success that you pursued for years or decades, but that were never actually yours, were values and ambitions you absorbed from culture or family or society without ever questioning whether they reflected what you actually want. This abandonment feels like failure, like wasting years of effort, like throwing away achievements that others would envy and that you worked hard to attain. But continuing to pursue these goals would mean remaining disconnected from your actual desires and values. You pursued career that was prestigious or lucrative or that your parents valued, but that does not actually interest or fulfill you. You worked toward lifestyle markers, house, marriage, children, possessions that represent success in your culture, but that do not actually align with how you want to live. You invested in building image and reputation and status that impresses others, but that feels empty when you achieve it because it is not connected to anything you genuinely care about. The cost of authenticity includes walking away from these pursuits even when you are close to achieving them, even when others cannot understand why you would abandon what they see as success, even when doing so means starting over or living with less, or accepting that you will not achieve the markers that society uses to measure worth. It means facing that you spent years pursuing wrong things, that the time and energy and sacrifice you invested were misdirected, that you must begin again from a place of not knowing what you actually want because you have been so focused on what you were supposed to want that you never developed clarity about your own authentic desires. This creates identity crisis because so much of who you believed yourself to be was organized around these goals and achievements, was defined by the path you were on and the success you were pursuing. When you abandon that path, you lose not just the goals, but the identity they provided. lose the structure and direction and sense of progress that came from working towards something, face the emptiness and uncertainty of not knowing what you are working toward, or whether you should be working toward anything at all rather than simply being. You feel lost, unmoored, without direction or purpose. You call this failure. It is the necessary emptiness between false self and authentic self. The sixth cost of authenticity is the terrifying period of not knowing who you are after you have dismantled the false self. But before the authentic self has emerged clearly is the liminal space where you have released all the identifications and roles and beliefs that gave you structure and direction, but have not yet discovered what remains when those constructions are removed. This period feels like dissolution, like losing yourself, like psychological death that has no guarantee of rebirth. You no longer know what you want because so many of your desires were adaptations rather than authentic wants. You no longer know what you believe because so many of your beliefs were absorbed rather than genuinely chosen. You no longer know who you are because so much of your identity was constructed rather than authentic. You exist in a state of radical uncertainty, where nothing feels solid or clear or known, where you cannot rely on old structures and have not yet developed new ones, where you must learn to tolerate not knowing while you wait for authentic self to emerge. This emptiness is terrifying because humans need structure and identity and direction, because not knowing who you are feels like not existing, because the uncertainty makes it impossible to make decisions or plans or commitments when you are not sure what you want or who you will become. You feel like you are regressing rather than progressing, like you are less functional now than when you were living as false self, like you have made terrible mistake by dismantling working system, even if that system was not authentic. The cost of authenticity includes tolerating this period without rushing to fill the emptiness with new constructions, without immediately creating new false self to replace old one, without grabbing onto new identifications and beliefs and structures just to escape the discomfort of not knowing. It requires faith that something will emerge if you can tolerate the emptiness. It requires accepting that you cannot force or control or predict what that something will be. Requires surrendering to process that feels like dissolution, but that may be necessary groundwork for genuine reconstruction based on authentic rather than adapted self. You must learn to live without their approval, without belonging, without external validation. You call this loneliness. It is the price of being yourself. The seventh cost of authenticity is learning to live without the external validation and approval and sense of belonging that the false self was designed to secure, is developing internal ground and internal sense of worth and internal capacity to validate your own choices and existence when the external world no longer provides these things. This is perhaps the most difficult cost because humans are fundamentally social creatures who evolved to need approval and belonging, because your nervous system is wired to seek these things, because living without them triggers ancient survival fears. When you lived as adapted self, you received constant validation from external world, praise for your achievements, approval for your choices, belonging in communities, confirmation that you were doing things right. This external validation provided sense of security and worth and direction, told you that you were on correct path and that you were acceptable and that you belonged. But authenticity means making choices that often do not receive external validation, means living according to values that others may not understand or support, means existing in ways that do not fit social norms or expectations. You must learn to validate yourself when nobody else validates you, must develop internal sense of rightness about your choices even when external world disapproves, must find sense of belonging within yourself when you no longer belong in external communities. This requires developing psychological capacities that the adapted self never needed, because the adapted self's entire function was to secure external validation, requires building internal resources, an internal sense of worth that is not dependent on others' approval or recognition. The loneliness of authenticity is not just social isolation, but is existential aloneness that comes from being fundamentally responsible for your own life without external structures to guide you or validate your choices, from living according to internal truth rather than external expectations, from being person that nobody prepared you to be and that nobody may understand or appreciate. You must learn to be alone with yourself, to be your own source of validation and direction and meaning, to find satisfaction in living authentically, even when that living brings no external rewards or recognition or belonging. Becoming who you are is not liberation. It is devastation, loss, grief, terror, loneliness, and you must go through it anyway. The psychological cost of authenticity includes recognizing that your entire personality is construction that must be dismantled, losing relationships that were based on false self you can no longer maintain, being excluded from communities and structures that cannot accommodate who you actually are, carrying guilt for disappointing people who loved the person you are no longer willing to be, abandoning goals and achievements that were never actually yours, tolerating terrifying period of not knowing who you are, learning to live without external validation and approval that false self was designed to secure. These costs are not hypothetical or exaggerated, or things you can avoid through doing authenticity correctly. They are inevitable consequences of choosing to be yourself in a world that rewards adaptation and punishes authenticity, in systems that require you to conform to gain belonging and approval, in relationships that were based on who you pretended to be rather than who you actually are. You cannot become authentic without paying these costs, because authenticity means refusing to continue adaptations that secured all the things you are now losing. But the alternative is remaining as false self for the rest of your life, is continuing to perform and adapt and suppress your actual nature, is never experiencing what it feels like to be genuinely known and loved for who you actually are, is reaching end of your life and discovering that you spent it being someone else. The cost of remaining inauthentic is different, but no less devastating. It is living as stranger to yourself. It is chronic sense of disconnection and dissatisfaction that no achievement can fix. It is knowledge that you are wasting your one life performing for others rather than living it. The pain of becoming who you are is real and unavoidable, but it is pain with purpose, is destruction that clears ground for genuine reconstruction, is death of false self that creates possibility for authentic self to finally emerge and exist in world. You must go through the devastation if you want to discover what remains when everything false is stripped away.